Kayla?
It's Walker. Kayla is my, Sarah Nikki.
Sarah Nikki.
Then Daniel Thomas. Yeah, I think Nikki and Kayla.
Oh, sure, yeah, we just want to show how many folks there.
Yeah,
No, they were all over the world.
yes,
Oh,
absolutely.
yeah, go ahead.
Or at least South America.
Yep. She was in North Korea for a long time.
We'll can have some stragglers come in. Hi, I'm Tim Schreiner, and I've known Greg Redlin, the author of this book, for 50 years, believe it or not. I can't believe it. Even though we're both only about 48 years old, we've known each other for 50 years. Greg is a native of Watertown and came to the university in 1967 to study and spent a good deal of time here. But one of the things that was going on at the university in those days was this famous murder that Thomas Whitehawk was involved in. And Greg became fascinated with the case. And ever since I've met Greg, I've had to listen to him talk about this endlessly. So I said, just write a damn book, will you? You know, just write a book and we'll be okay. So he did that. He spent a long time, did a lot of research, went back to the original records, and so he could write a good fictionalized account of this. He worked at the university and got a couple of advanced degrees here. So he's been around a long time, left for a little while, and then when he retired, he came back. I think there are 3 good reasons to read this book if you haven't read it yet. Well, 4 if you count the great photo on the cover, which is a whole other story. You know, this is a case that happened in our community, involving a downtown merchant and his wife and 2 students at the University of South Dakota, one of whom was Thomas Whitehawk. And so just the fact that it happened here, and one of the most important things or noteworthy things that happened here makes it worth reading. I think I came to the university soon after that, even though I'm older than Greg, but I think Greg really captures that late 1960s sort of culture and feeling of the community and the university at the time. He really captures it well, the good sense of what the university was like then, what Vermillion was like then. And the third and most important reason probably to read this book is that, you know, as we've become more concerned with unequal justice in this country regarding some groups, the issues that this case put forth in the community and that people had to deal with are still issues that we're grappling with today. The issues of unequal justice when it concerns some people. So that makes it a compelling read even to this day, even though it happened 55 years ago, almost 55 years ago. So anyway, with that, Greg's going to read a little bit from the book and introduce you to some of the characters in the book and talk about it. So, Greg Redlin.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Tim. You read it just like I wrote it. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. My family and close friends, I deeply appreciate your interest in the book and coming here this evening, even though I know there are a lot of competing demands for your time on a night like this. I also want to thank the library. Dan Bernison is here, who is the director of the library, and Kendra Brewer, who helped with some of with the presentation that we'll show you in just a few minutes. I wanted to start this evening by reading a section from the book, and then we'll see where that takes us after that. I'm reading from the prologue in Whitehawk. For some living in this small Midwestern town, a newspaper headline unsealed a decades-old trauma they thought had lost the power over them. South Dakota murderer ends up dying in middle-aged death. Thomas Whitehawk's passing recalls the pain of the 1960s crime commutation fight. It was in the Argus Leader. This headline, brief and compressed as it was, carried a sense of relief. Tom had finally paid in full for his unspeakable crime. There was some justice in that sentiment, for the crime was brutal and impossible to understand. But retribution in this case has a hollow feel to it. The rush to punish the criminal with equally painful action. We had forgotten in the rush to punish the criminal with painful action. We had forgotten to ask about the root cause of his actions. What background and influences and mental processes were at work in this gifted 18-year-old athlete and university student? Why did he, on an unseasonably warm Good Friday morning, slip into the side entrance of a modest home and murder a defenseless 62-year-old man and rape his wife? Why did he remain at the scene, hiding out in the house all day, waiting for the sheriff to come and arrest him? Tom's parents died when he was young, 11 years old. He was placed in the Hare home on the Rosebud Reservation, arriving, now in quotes, so lonely and so strong. All he had with him was a change of clothes and a little brown sack, recalled the boarding school principal. As Tom grew older, the melancholy he inherited from his father emerged, despite the awards and the honors he received at a military academy he attended after boarding school. Extraordinary athlete that he was, it was the one thing that he could not run away from. After the military academy, Tom attended the University of South Dakota in Vermilion, where he lost his bearings, untethered from a boarding school or academy routine. Vermilion was a one-company college town built on a Missouri River bluff. The river current cut away that bluff, steep and high enough for the Nakota Sioux to convert it into a death trap, herding buffalo over it and slaughtering the injured. The river meanders by Vermilion, the shifting currents creating sandbars that the students sunbathe and party on. The town's elm-lined streets were named after Ivy League universities, Harvard and Yale, symbolizing the confidence Eastern educators had brought to the prairie when they came to teach in this higher education outpost. When Tom walked Vermilion streets nearly a century later, the town's split personality was apparent. A broom factory, alfalfa processing plant, hardware store, locker plant, and a lumber yard lent the town its rural background. The 3-2 beer joints, jewelry stores, the stylish fashions in the clothing stores, and Old Main's Tower on campus implied that the town's identity was more diverse and more complex than its rural context. Vermilion was different. Democrats won local elections here. The Lutherans and the Catholics claimed the majority of churchgoers, but it was the Congregational Church's towering colonial revival that drew the eye on Main Street. On campus, Greek life siphoned off many of the students who spent 4 years in its arcane world. Fraternity and sorority exchanges, pledge life, hell weeks, ugly man contests, insignia stamped clothing, and a musical variety show called Strollers defined the college experience. The rest of the students, the independents, watched the Greeks play with a mixture of envy, irony, and indifference. Beneath the placid surface, prejudice swirled deep in Vermilion, as deceptive and treacherous as a Missouri River current. For Tom, the town was a strange place, welcoming to his handsome face. It was suspicious of his background and color when he wasn't in the room. For me, college was the next step in my given trajectory. I was following my father's path, political science major, law school, law practice. Tom's tragedy changed all that. Tom's crime took place 5 decades ago. Things have changed. The boarding schools Tom attended and thousands of others are no longer operating. Their harsh methods and now unthinkable goal of cultural integration and assimilation condemned. University students have more access to mental health services regardless of skin color. Murder cases are assigned experienced salaried counsel. Plea and death sentence in less than 10 months would not be tolerated, regardless of how dreadful the crime or the race of the accused. And yet, despite the progress, whites and Native Americans face one another across an expanse as wide as the Missouri River in the late spring. Okay, let's see a prologue to Whitehawk. And I think it sets the scene pretty well. But I'd like to go with talk about that scene for the scene that started the whole incident. Every time I start thinking about this, the last couple of days, I'm thinking again about Tom Whitehawk and Willie Stans and what they were facing and why they did what they did, and the immense sadness and confusion rise up again every time. It seems like I'm reading the story again for the first time. Its power is incredible. Tom Whitehawk and Willie Stans, young Native men, while they're really boys, left their Julian Hall dorm room 619 on a cloudy, foggy, uncharacteristically warm Good Friday morning in 1967. They had been partying the night before until 12 o'clock at what was known then as Thorsten's Bar, which ultimately became our place, right adjacent to Gary's, and just a storefront down from Yale Jewelry. So if you think about that just juxtaposition is very close. Tom and Willie drank 3-2 beer and played a lot of pool that night. Got home. Before they got home, they bought 4 quarts of 3-2 beer, and they hid it along with a .22 rifle in a construction site just west of the campus. So when they got up and left Julian Hall, it was about 5 a.m. in the morning. They walked down about 4 blocks to this construction site where they had hid the rifle and the beer. They paused to drink 1 of the quarts of beer and took the other 2 quarts with them. They swung back to University Street, I think more or less right where it terminated. At that time, it's like the entrance of Slagle Hall. They walked down in that street. It was, again, it was foggy and very warm and Good Friday morning. So there were no cars in the street and no people, of course, pedestrians around. And so they walked right down the middle of the street, drinking their beer and carrying their rifle. They stopped at the intersection for a moment. If you recall, that intersection of Main and University has a light on it, and that light was, they could actually hear the light mechanism changing. They were digital back 55 years ago. They could hear that mechanism changing it from green to yellow to red, green to yellow, red. They crossed the street and then started going down University Street. As you all probably know, there are some Victorian-like homes in those first 3, 4, 5 homes, and then the architecture changes. You have mostly Cape Cod homes and pre-World War II craftsman homes. They walked down to 315 University Street, where Jim and Dorothy Yadel lived. Dorothea, I'm sorry. Jim and Dorothea had been in Vermillion for 30 years. Jim ran a jewelry store, Yadel Jewelry, just across from Dan and Krista Halverson's father's jewelry store. They stood on the lawn and were a bit confused about what they were going to do. What was the plan? Well, they had no plan really. They had a gun, they were drunk, and they were going to go inside. Willie kept pressing Tom, what's the plan? What's the plan? What are we going to do? At that point, Tom had probably fallen into some sort of psychotic episode. He just looked at Willie, turned back and walked to the north side of the Yedo home and took the rifle and busted open a glass, or there was a glass divided window on the north side of their house, smashed the window with the rifle, reached in and unlocked the door, turned and nodded to Willie as casually as if he were going into his own home. Come on in, let's go. Well, from there, a night of terror, of course, came about. Tom shot Jim Yedo twice with a .22 rifle. It's here and it's here. And he raped Mrs. Yedo twice during the day. He stayed the entire day until about 6 o'clock in the evening, and the authorities began to show up, the police and the sheriff's office. And finally, the Sheriff Arnie Nelson and the Chief of Police Merle Offerdahl opened the same door that Tom Whitehawk had opened to get inside the house. Tom had let Mrs. Whitehawk out about an hour before that. And she was, of course, she was in shock and trauma, but she was sane enough. She had enough competence in her mind at that time to communicate that there was a large Indian man who had raped her and another one who had fled before sometime in the morning, as a matter of fact. Well, Arnie and Merle walked in through the house and finally walked up the stairs and into there's a suite of bedrooms, and the Yedos were in different bedrooms. And they went, they saw Jim, and then, matter of fact, backtracking my story just a bit, when Merle and Arnie opened the door, they walked in, and to the left, the stairs dropped down into an old-fashioned basement with a furnace, and not a dirt floor, but an unfinished floor. And Arnie looked, and he saw a rag rug wrapped around Jim Yedo, and he saw his feet. And he knew as soon as he saw the feet in that rug on the furnace floor that Jim Yedo was dead. So they went upstairs, and they finally found Tom Whitehawk. He was hiding out in Dorothy Yedo's closet and had taken all her clothes and had covered himself to hide. And Arnie said he had a gun in one hand, and he reached in and grabbed his hair and pulled him out and arrested him. 9 months later, Tom Whitehawk was sentenced to death in that short of time. You know, these days you wouldn't get somebody arraigned in 9 months, to say nothing of finding him guilty and sending him to the state prison for electrocution at a date established by the judge at that time. Okay, so again, that's sort of the context that we're talking about. That's what led up to the scene. Kendra has put together, with my very little help, a nice little slideshow of the characters. And I wanted to show this because we all know I wrote a novel, and every novelist is going to take literary license with what he or she is doing. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why I decided to write the novel, because I think it came together dramatically better than if I had written a nonfiction book. And I think that turned out to be the right judgment. However, with the exception, I think, of two characters in the book, every character was based on a real life person who played a big, large substantive role in the Tom Whitehawk affair. And I think we've got them all here. This is Tom Whitehawk after graduation at Shattuck Military Academy. He went there in his sophomore year. Phil Zobek, his mentor, man who had come from Minneapolis to save the world under the cloak of the Episcopalians, and was at the Hare home when Tom came with a paper sack of his belongings. He convinced Tom to leave Todd County Schools, where he was going to school, and go to Shattuck Military Academy, which is an Episcopalian institution, and a nice, very good institution. They have beautiful grounds. Tom went there and did very well. Academically, maybe so-so, but athletically, he was a huge star. And on graduation day, he won several awards. He played tackle. He was a relentless tackler and he passed out a couple times. He was playing so hard, and he had a concussion that he had received his first year at Shattuck at a track meet in Minneapolis. He played basketball and then track, and he was both a runner and did as well as the field events. He broke the Minnesota state pole vault record his junior year. I mean, he was a great athlete, but a troubled young man. While Tom was in jail here, he and Willie quickly, especially Tom, quickly became friends with the sheriff's staff. And in fact, at that time, the sheriff cooked the meals for the inmates. And after a while, Tom and Willie began to cook their own meals. And Tom painted a lot. And he, now this picture doesn't, we didn't have a very good photo to take the picture, but this is he painted this while he was here in jail. This is it, the pole vault, the bar setup, whatever. And you can see the pole vaulter right here. He's just about ready to release the pole and jump over the bar. And then you see some spectators here. I've seen that photo in color, and it's really quite dramatic. Here are a couple of the principals. Of course, this is Lee McMccarran, who was the defense attorney. Lee had represented Tom when Tom was in Minneapolis, stole a car, drove back to the university, and then stupidly got caught or got busted going through a stoplight or a stop sign. I'm sorry. So he got busted, and they discovered that he was in a stolen car. He needed representation, and Mick McCarran represented him. Mick did a good job on this case, and he worked with Judge Nickel. Fred Nickel was a federal district court judge at that time. He heard many of the AIM cases, as a matter of fact, and he was a good man. And he took quite an interest in Tom Whitehawk, and talked to him after the sentencing in his private chambers, about his life and what he was going to do. This is the judge in the case, James Bandy. He was approximately 70 years old at the time, kind of an uptight, by the rule judge. Again, he and Mick were both the kinds of characters who one needed not so much imagination as just to draw what you understood, what I understood about these characters, because they were not larger than life, but they were wonderful cross sections of life and a good representation of their respective professions. Here are a couple of interesting pictures. This is Doug Heise, who was a priest at the Episcopal Church here in town. The Heises were great friends of Tom Whitehawk, and they visited him while he was in jail and while he was in prison. And they show up in the book to some degree. Tom Whitehawk, when he was waiting in the Yeddo's home that morning after the murder and the rape, he called Doug Heise and talked to him, and didn't really let on what was happening. Made out as if he were going to go to church that evening, or perhaps on Saturday for Saturday Lenten services. He was a good friend and stayed a good friend throughout the process. This man is also a very famous man. He's not in the South Dakota Hall of Fame. He certainly should be. Ramon Rubidoux. Many of you know him. He, at that time, he was the first Indian to practice law in South Dakota. He represented AIM in the negotiations with Senators McGovern and Averesk in 1973 at the occupation of Wounded Knee. When he came onto this case, he was representing Willie Stans, Whitehawk's partner. At that time, he had won 21 cases. He had not lost a single case at that point in his life. Very interesting man and did a lot of interesting things. This is Mr. and Mrs. Artichoker. They were the people who were running the Hare home. Tom, when his parents died at age 11, he was in a boarding school at Rosebud. He was there 1 year, and then he grew. He was old, so he was moved out older than the other students. So he was moved out to the Hare home, which was a wonderful home, an Episcopalian institution run by the Artichokers. They had it was a working farm. They did all sorts of made all sorts of crafts, and was, I think, a wonderful place for Tom, and a place he probably should have stayed rather than transferring to Shattuck. One of the persons who was working again in the Hare home was Phil Zolbeck, and we'll see him in a minute. He's the man who was there working as a maintenance man and a counselor and whatnot. Here's a great picture of downtown Vermillion at the time. And I can't quite read what was playing at the co-ed. And it's not just my bad eyes. It's just so blurry that I really can't read it. Here is a butcher. He worked at IGA, I'm sure. And there was a large meat counter at IGA, for those of you who were around at that time. And he's still in his butcher's apron crossing the street. So we were sort of a one-horse town back then. This is Phil Zolbeck, the man who was his unofficial guardian, mentor, the man who persuaded Tom to go to Shattuck Military Academy. And interestingly enough, when Tom transferred then to Shattuck, Phil found a job a couple of blocks down from Shattuck in St. James Boys School. So he was nearby the entire time when Tom was at Shattuck, and was still deeply involved in Tom's life. This is the man who was the state's attorney at the time, Chuck Wolski, and someone, Paul Hassey, told me that he's still living in Florida and apparently has read the book. But I haven't heard anything more from him about it. He was not portrayed that with a friendly eye, so he may not have much to say about the book now. So that's enough of me talking, at least in terms of a presentation. But I'm here to answer any questions that you might have about the book how it was written, why it was written, anything you might have.
Why? Why?
What I read. That's I have to be honest about this. I didn't come to this book and this topic because I wanted to right some wrongs about Tom Whitehawk and the justice system, and the harsh methods of the training boarding schools on the reservations. I came to it just wanting to write a book. I wanted to write a novel in the worst way, and had thought about that for a long time. I graduated from here in 1971 with a political science degree. I didn't really have, I had taken several English courses, but I hadn't taken English courses with a mind toward, being an English academician or involved in English somehow. I didn't understand the periods and modernism and postmodernism. I knew nothing of that. But when I got to after graduation, I went to San Francisco, and for whatever reason, the ambiance, the city itself just had a great influence on me. And I started reading fiction, and a lot of fiction. And that's where I gained the ambition. Now I married that ambition then with the story, because the story is, it just really, I was telling Dan earlier, it just sort of fell in my lap. I mean, it was just so compelling throughout. And the characters were all so well defined and had so many conflicts that it was quite easy, I thought anyway, to write about them in this story. And in fact, most of the scenes that where Tom Whitehawk is involved, or any of the attorneys or judges or what have you, are all based on the same day, the same location, and the same people. And in some cases, I had bits and pieces of dialogue. I would have to add to that at times. But so about 3/4 of the way through the book, I mean, other than it just being when I graduated from high school, for instance, I had heard about the story, but it was just it was the sensationalism of it. He murdered this man and raped his wife. My God, there was nothing worse than that when we heard it in Watertown in 1967. So it stayed lodged in, my teeny brain through all those years. And in fact, when I came back to Vermilion after living in San Francisco for 3 years, I wrote a letter to Tom Whitehawk, who was in prison at the time. And I asked him whether or not he would want to participate in some sort of book. And he declined to do that. But I went on with the ambition, not writing it just yet, because I was working, I had to make a living. And once I retired while we were in Mississippi, I took a couple courses there, and then I came back and got an MA in English, and started to write this novel as part of my master's thesis at USD. And I finished it. So when I finished it, I still pretty much had, as Tim Schreiner can tell you, and he was one of my early readers, it was still just, an amateur work. And it was, arguably may still be. He helped me enormously, and Tim also, and Ruth Hamill were also instrumental in convincing me to publish the book. I don't think I would have, but it was one night over there, and we were drinking perhaps the second glass of third wine, and they convinced me that I ought to do it, and I'm very happy that I did.
Thank you.
How long did it take you to do the entire project?
I took my time in grad school too, because I didn't have to get out and find a job and start making a living. So I dawdled around for about 2.5 years, just messing around with it, and finally got it finished and did my my defense of the thesis. But then I spent at least 3 more years probably getting it ready. You know, and that would be, you know, I didn't write every single day, but I did try to keep a schedule of writing 2 or 3 hours in the morning. There's a lot of research that I did too. So the research took quite a bit of time. Most of the real gold mine of data and information on Tom Whitehawk resides right over here in our county courthouse in the clerk of court's office. There's a big Whitehawk file and it's just a big old box, and it's now been what's the word? Not conserved, but there's a word that it'll come to me in a few minutes. But the files have not been organized, and they're not organized alphabetically or any other way for that matter. So you have to dig through it to find everything. And there was a lot there. Tom had a trial here, of course. But he had a preliminary hearing, a trial. There were enormous amount of transcripts that had to do with the trial itself, and then the request for a second trial generated another huge amount of documents. And during that time, Tom Whitehawk also appeared after his sentencing, but while he was in the prison, he appeared before the State Board of Charities and Corrections. And that, there's a lot of paper that was generated from that particular hearing. Tom was not the only person. There were 4 or 5 other people who also testified on behalf of Tom, who was looking for a commutation from the governor. The way the law read at the time, the Board of Pardons and Paroles had to recommend to the governor that Tom the sentence be commuted. So in that testimony that day, and it must have taken hours, it's a long testimony, and it's just a fascinating read. I read some of it this afternoon, as a matter of fact. And he talks a lot. They ask a lot of questions about what you did and why you did it, and so he traces everything that he did that day, and it ended up in the book. That was the big reveal. In the book, I didn't talk much about that day, about what happened that day. I wanted to keep some suspense. So what you find in the book is perhaps 85% of Tom Whitehawk. And then I edited that, and then I added some here and there. I would add a sentence or a paragraph as needed. But it's primarily his recording of his remembrance of that night and that day in the Yale home. It was interesting. He talked about it 3 times, and Willie Stans once, and all 4 are a little different. So the memories even then were fading, and that's another reason why I preferred to write a novel rather than a nonfiction, but because most of the principals are deceased, or those who are not think they remember how it went or what happened, or I had a conversation with so and so, but it's very unreliable information. I mean, I think in the end you're left with possibly a good story, but it needs to be fictionalized to fill it out. You can't rely upon people's memories. They're just, and that's why the courts are so suspicious of careful about testimony, testimony of events that happened a long time ago.
Do you know if there were more than one parole hearing? Because I happened to sit next to Lee McCarran at a banquet. I think it was probably late 70s, early 80s. And McCarran said to me, "Tomorrow I'm going to Sioux Falls to spring out Tom Whitehawk." And that was his words. And I don't know if he was influential in any of the hearings, but I'm sure he was there. But were there more than one of those hearings along the way?
Yeah. He testified a number of times. first testimony was taken by Arnie Nelson, the sheriff. You know, when Arnie pulled that long black hair out, it took him right down to the courthouse where the sheriff's office was at the time. And he took Arnie in, took Tom Whitehawk into a cell and sat with him in the cell, and Tom sat on the bed. And he talked about what he did that day. It's sketchy, it's not very helpful, but it is what it is. The next time that he talked at length about that day was at the request for a new trial, and that was in the spring of 1968. And that request for a new trial, at the request for a new trial, he testified and talked a lot about about that day. And you know, in fact, he broke down crying in the witness stand, talking about the rape. So backing up again, once with Arnie, once at the request for a new trial, and then once before, half a year later, a testimony before the Board of Charities and Corrections, who had the power to recommend to the governor commutation. And then he appeared before the Board of Pardons and Paroles. It might have been one of these times that Mick was talking about, 9 times requesting a commutation, and he was turned down every time. There was also, he also entered a writ of habeas corpus, which was not successful. And then he wrote a 297-page screed about the death penalty. And it was just, you know, a jumble of thoughts that he had compiled. He became kind of a courthouse lawyer. And he was a bright man. There's a lot of, you know, when people first hear about the story, often they've been told that Tom was pre-med, and he nominally was, but Tom didn't have the passion nor the interest in medical education, and his grades even in Shattuck were poor, very average. 9 times before the Board of Pardons and Paroles, the writ of habeas corpus, and when he wrote the 297-page screed, Bill Janklow got a hold of it, and of course that's the last we ever heard of anything happening with Tom Whitehawk's case. Even his attorney at the time, Douglas Hall, who was a smart, bright labor attorney from Minneapolis, said once Janklow got it, that was the end of it. And it was. And Tom stayed in prison, of course, until 1997, and he died at age 49. He had grown very large in prison, and quite a loner. Played the guitar and read a lot, but stayed to himself most of the time. I've talked to at least 2 people who, Mark Sanderson for one, who was working at the penitentiary teaching their GED program, and he knew Whitehawk, and so did Martin Brokenleg, who visited the prison quite a bit and did a lot of prison ministry. He said that you know, Tom was quiet and gentle and well behaved, but you know, he held it all in. It was in him, and obviously he wasn't ready to come talk about it. One of the we should talk about Jerry Visner, the man who wrote this pamphlet. After Tom was sentenced to death, that news hit the Minneapolis Tribune, and a man called Gerald Visner read it. He was a community organizer, a la Barack Obama at the time in Minneapolis. He saw that, and he headed for South Dakota, he wrote this pamphlet, and I wish I had a photo of him, I don't. He wrote the pamphlet that is a wonderful, wonderful pamphlet that tells the story of Tom Whitehawk. And he became ultimately, I mean, he was responsible for hiring the attorney Doug Hall, who came and helped represent Tom when he was requesting a commutation of his sentence. So without Gerald Visner, Tom Whitehawk would have died an early death. But Gerald Visner wrote the pamphlet, and it triggered a fundraising effort in the fall of 1968. They raised $25,000. I read through all of the contributors, and their names are in, for whatever reason, the Frank Farrar archives in Pierre. I read through all the archives of Frank Farrar because he was the governor at the time who commuted Tom's sentence.
Greg, can you talk about that a little bit, the atmosphere in the state and why Farrar, who is seemingly not the governor you would expect it to commute a sentence,
Sure.
What was happening and why he did it?
Sure. As you can imagine, when the news hit Vermilion, it was a shocking, traumatic event, and it just like an earthquake. It went through, the news went through town, and there were people who would have hung Tom Whitehawk that night when he was in Arnie's Clay County Sheriff's Office jail, and they were gathering, a lot of them, some of the people who were expressing some interest in, hanging Tom Whitehawk for what he did. They were hanging out in the Rotunda area, and I'm not sure what ultimately persuaded them not to do it. I presume it was probably Arnie Nelson, who was a good man, a very good man. He ended his life, unfortunately, with a crime, sort of an unspeakable one. But Arnie Nelson was a good man, and he treated Tom Whitehawk in these stands very well. But in the state itself, I mean, there was, as you can imagine, in 1967, an Indian man who committed a murder like that was viewed as just a killer and nothing else. No one wanted to know about what forces had been at play with this young, but very young and beautiful, but very ill young man. So it would have been, without Arnie there, it could have been very ugly, because I think Arnie probably talked him out of it. Gerald Visner talked a lot about that atmosphere. I was always a little suspicious of what he wrote about the atmosphere here in Vermilion, claiming that it was anti-Indian, and he was an Indian, although he didn't look particularly native, but he was Indian. He thought that the atmosphere here was very anti-Indian, whether he was registering for a motel room or getting service at a restaurant. But he was the kind of man who was brilliant and looked for, discrimination as hard as he could and found it. And he was a writer too, so he was someone who was recording all of that and talked about it in that pamphlet that he wrote about the atmosphere. Now, there was an enormous effort to commute Tom Whitehawk's sentence, even though the Board of Pardons and Paroles didn't want to do it. There was an enormous effort to do it, and there was an effort to send letters to Frank Farrar, who sort of had this crime dropped in his lap. Niels Bohr was the governor who retired and ended his term in 1967, and Frank Farrar became governor then in 1968. Farrar received a ton of mail. I read through most of the letters, and the letters they're very interesting reads. They argue, or their principal arguments are the reason for for Tom Whitehawk to pay for the crime that he committed, that is, die in the electric chair, had 3 points in their argument. One, that capital punishment is a deterrent. 2, that it's in the Bible. And 3, what was the third one? I can't bring back the third one, but the people who were arguing that Tom's life should be saved made the same points, that it was not a deterrent, that the Bible clearly says capital punishment is not Christ's way. I can't remember the third item, but they all argued the same point with a different argument, but with the same information, the same points in their argument. So Farrar was genuinely, I think, perplexed and confused about what the right thing to do would be in this case. Ultimately, though, he said that he said 2 or 3 different things after he commuted the sentence. He said, well, there would have been a race ride in South Dakota if I had let him hang, but he really should have hung. He deserved it. Or a second time he was asked and he said, well, tourism is a big business in South Dakota. And if we had killed that Indian, it would have ruined tourism in South Dakota for God knows how long. And I don't know, maybe he was right. At the time, there was a good deal of coverage. ABC, CBS, and Sandra Van Oker's program came and did stories on, and the New York Times did stories on Tom Whitehawk, and the incident itself had a huge article in the New York Times. So there was a lot of attention, both internationally and nationally and locally, and you could see it in the letters where the letters were coming from. So ultimately, he decided to commute, and this will just take a moment. I want to read his press release at the time that he commuted Tom Whitehawk's sentence. Even in the light of this tragic crime, perhaps one positive development has come from this entire case, focusing the attention of the plight of some of our Indian people who have lived for decades under federal control in poverty and in many cases less than human dignity. Thomas James Whitehawk is a product of a tragic social environment. Unlike the majority of American youth, he was deprived of full benefits of parental direction because of their death during his formative years. In addition, Thomas Whitehawk suffered some traumatic personal experiences along with a severe head injury during his youth. All of these factors could have conspired to motivate the brutal crime to which he now pays his debt to society. So, I thought that was quite eloquent and a sensitive statement. Unfortunately, as I said, that he went on to say some pretty brutal things. He is still alive, as many of you know, and he is an incredible athlete and has run triathlons into his 90s. He's still up in Britain, South Dakota.
What's the name of that governor that commuted?
Frank Farrar.
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 I have a question too about an earlier thing you touched on. I didn't bring my hearing aids tonight. Was it?
My wife has the same problem.
Was it Attorney McCarron that got delayed with running the stoplight, or was that someone else? And how did that figure into the scenario?
Well, Tom ran a stoplight and was stopped. They checked his ID, and of course they ran a search on his ID, and they discovered that he was wanted for car theft in Minneapolis.
Car theft? The attorney,
Now,
McCarron?
yes. Now, when he was arrested for that, he needed an attorney, and I think it was Arnie Nelson who referred him to Mick McCarron. Mick was a
No. Who was the person that was wanted for car theft?
Tom Whitehawk.
Okay.
Yeah,
And they found that out because of somebody running a stop sign?
yeah, it was Tom in the car that he stole.
Tom Whitehawk was in a stolen car.
Yes.
Running a red light,
Yes,
and then they found out he had a previous
yes,
conviction for
Yes.
doing car theft.
yes, yes.
And this was, at what point was this before
This
the
was in
murder?
the fall of 1967,
Before or after the murder?
before the murder.
Had to be, because he was in jail after.
Right. It was before the murder, and that's how he grew to know Lee McCarron, was through that case. So when he then subsequently murdered Yato, he needed an attorney, and the only one he knew was Mick McCarron. Mick was, I mean, he just like Frank Farrar, I mean, he had sort of had it dropped in his lap. Mick was just out of law school. He had spent a year as a clerk in the Rapid City, South Dakota Circuit Court, and had just started his law practice here. So he had never worked as a defense or prosecutor, for that matter, in a murder trial.
Yeah.
And it began to show, both in the work that he did and the how he approached it. But again, I have a lot of empathy for Mick McCarron, because he had the entire community against him too.
Yeah.
Back to the old
I got to know him when his washing machine broke and we met at the laundromat.
oh yeah, I'll bet he was happy about that.
Yeah.
And I'll bet he expressed that happiness to you. Yeah, Mick was quite a character.
What were the challenges of making a fictionalized version of something that had actually happened for when you write a novel?
Yeah. What are the challenges?
Yeah, what was the challenge? Because obviously you probably could have written a nonfiction
Yeah.
version of it.
Yeah.
But how do you make a novel out of something that actually happened? For you, what was the process of you being able
Yeah.
to do that? Yeah.
Yeah, well, you take a lot of literary license, which means that you fudge a lot of things, but not as many as you might think. When I started writing Whitehawk, I didn't have a narrator yet, and I knew that was the key to putting this book together, was to have a protagonist who could conceivably be at most of these stopping points throughout Tom Whitehawk's life, or particularly from when he committed the crime until his sentence was commuted. And who would that be? It couldn't be Tom Whitehawk. I would have, I have second thoughts about cultural appropriation and how it's used these days, but that might have been cultural appropriation in my case, to write it from his point of view. And it would have been a failure as a novel if I had. But so I was struggling on, how can I do this? How can where's my through line from the beginning to the end on this? And then it occurred to me, I was looking at old volants in the Heidi Weeks library. And there was a story there on the Willie stands after Tom Whitehawk was tried. Willie was tried in Yankton County. He was tried there, and a man by the name of Craig Lawrence, who was the Volant editor, I think at the time, he went over, he covered the Stands trial, and there's some pictures of him with Willie and Ramon Rubidoux, as a matter of fact. And it just occurred to me suddenly, there is my narrator. Not Craig, but someone that would be like Craig, who would be, an ambitious young kid, but someone who, really didn't have the experience of the world that he thought he had, and began to follow the story. And in one sense, you can read this novel as a coming of age story. It's, Craig Peters' coming of age. So when I did that, I had my narrator, but I still didn't have the platform to launch the novel. And finally, it occurred to me that I had tried to write, and they're pathetic attempts at writing a novel about a fraternity. And it occurred to me then that I could use that. I could start with the narrator being a member of a fraternity, writer on the volant, and he, comes into, has an interaction with Tom Whitehawk because the murder was so sensational, and it started from there. And then I backtracked and decided that I would have Tom go through fraternity rush, and that's where Craig Peters met him. And all of that was really, when I wrote this book, I had most of the concrete details of what I wanted in that particular scene, and it was always something that came back from my memory somehow. And so with that kind of context, then I dropped the characters into it and went from there. You raise your hand, Kathleen?
Yeah.
When are we gonna be able
With the
to?
holiday season coming up and this being such a locally specific book, how do I buy it to gift to my friends and family?
Oh, good
Oh.
question.
She's your marketing person, is that?
There are two ways. You can line up here afterward and I'll sign one for you, or you can go to Amazon and it's on Amazon. I'll take a couple minutes here just to describe the publication process, and it's really kind of interesting. I won't take long.
I just wanted to ask you before these photos go away, whether outside of the book, or this wonderful book, do you consider Philip Zubek, which is it?
Philip Zobek.
Zobek, do you consider him to have been a pedophile?
Yeah, I get that question often. And yes, I do.
And so perhaps, or almost certainly, Whitehawk suffered at his hands.
Yes. Yeah, I don't know if there was actual physical intimacy between the two of them, but I know that there was a lot of creepy stuff that that Phil Zobek did while, he went on camping trips with him and showed him how to ride a horse. I mean, he was a teacher, and parts of him were a good man, but he was clearly interested in young boys, and followed Tom to Shattuck when he got him that transfer, and he was working at a young boys Episcopalian school, St. James, just a few blocks away from Shattuck Military Academy. So that obsession, with Tom was clearly one that was romantic on his part. But he, interestingly enough, I'm pretty sure he died. All I know he died. But he worked throughout his life with young boys, a young boy, in institutions throughout his life. So the interest was there. I don't know if it was ever consummated. Tom didn't talk about it, of course. You wouldn't expect him to. But that would be one more trauma to have to deal with when your parents are dead. You've been raised. He was raised in a little shanty north of Mission on the Rosebud Reservation. You've seen pictures of that. It's just a little shack, logs and mud as stucco or as grout in the logs, and it was a pathetic life. And his father, Calvin, was a mean drunk. He was an awful man in many ways, and he generally took it out on his wife, Tom's mother, Dorothy McBride. She was a beautiful Indian and French woman, long black hair, but very subservient to Calvin, her husband.
Is your book in the library here?
Yes, there are copies at I think they've got 3, I don't know. They may be all checked out, so you could get one here. They have been, I know that Dan keeps me kind of apprised of it. He said that they are checked out quite a bit. But you know, this is my local market. This is where I'm going to generate interest in the book. And someday I hope, you know, I'd like to get a commercial publisher, but it's just, and I'd like to get, you know, an agent, but, you know, securing an agent, you would think that wouldn't be such a difficult job at all. I've got this great book. Jerry can tell you how difficult it is to get an agent, to say nothing of a publisher, to show some interest in your book. So I'm kind of stymied by that. Other than, you know, just wrapping up my book and sending it to 10 publishers that I think would be interested and wait for a reaction or non-reaction. You know, but,
Is this version self-published or how did it come along?
yeah, it's self-published, and the way I went about it was I looked around on the internet a little bit, and I found that a group of editors had split off from a group called Create Space, which had done work for people who are interested in self-publishing, and they had technical expertise as well as editors who read the text to put your book into the format that it needed to be for an ebook or a printed book. So they created this new organization called Elite Authors, and I contracted with them. I sent my text to them. They had a very, very good copy editor, and I worked with her with a couple drafts back and forth. They didn't change much, but they know where to put a comma and a period, and they are very good. It really, I think, helped the clarity of the book, and I was very happy that I did that. They then, when they're finished with the editorial work, they put your book into 2 files. One file is ebook format, and the other file is the printed form. They sent that to me, and then I uploaded it to Amazon, their Kindle publishing arm. And if it's in the right format, they'll take it. If it's got one little comma out of place, you know, they'll reject it. But thankfully, they accepted it. And then they ask you several questions about text and font and cover. By the way, this cover was not, they would have designed a cover for me, and it would have been a good cover. But Tim Schreiner had several photographs that I liked a lot, particularly this one. It's of Spirit Mountain. And so I asked them if they could use this photograph, and they said, sure. And they loved it. They thought it was very good. So once I got it onto Kindle, then they asked questions about text, about font, about what you want to charge for your book, and how much that, depending on what you're charging, how much your royalty will be. So you complete all that information. You press the button. 2 days later, you're up on.
Really? So it was all pretty much done online?
Yeah.
And the company is located where?
They're located, this one is located in South Carolina, in Charleston. There are a lot of companies out there, and some are kind of shams or questionable, and some are, you know, very good. So you have to be careful about who you're working with. I initially went to a different publisher that Matt Moen had used for his. He wrote a book about cats, and he had it published. And I went to that publisher first, but they had been acquired by a Christian publisher in Florida, and it wasn't a good match. So I looked for another one and found this organization called Elite Authors.
What about the paper version then? What did you do to get it printed then?
It's interesting. I can get author's copies, which are a little less than the $15 that you have to pay. But when someone, let's say Chuck Wolski, who's now retired and living in Coral Gables or someplace, decides, hey, I want to read that book. I was the main character in that whole situation. He orders the book through Amazon, but they print it somewhere down there on demand,
Oh,
and they send it to him then. So it was probably printed within 60 miles of where Chuck lives and sent to him on demand.
okay.
I have 10 copies here, or, when people ask, can I get your book, or do you have extras? But I only have 10 on hand. There isn't any reason to have any more than that. You, of course, will take all of that inventory this evening, so I'll have to.
Right. I just have one comment. I appreciate it as kind of a local person, being able to identify 99% of the characters, because you changed the names just enough. But the one that I didn't catch was,
Joan Holter.
well, no, I got that one, but Craig Lawrence. He went on to be probably one of the more successful people in the history of advertising in South Dakota, with Lawrence and Schiller out of Sioux Falls. I think they're the largest starting from scratch ad agency in the last 50 years anyway.
Oh, yeah.
In South Dakota, and they do worldwide stuff. He's retired now, but I worked with him a lot on tourism things, and I'm sure there's other characters in your book that went on to do great things, but you can't really get into that, doing this particular book. But
Yeah.
I'm glad I figured out Craig Lawrence, because
Yeah. I didn't, I used Craig as just an archetype. And then added, there is also a love interest in that book. And, that was something that, I thought, I wanted to do and I needed to do to complete, the novel is, any novel that you read provides context for what you're writing about. And I needed background on some of the principles, and the quote unquote Craig Lawrence or Craig Peters character had a lot of background, which you might find familiar with my background. So I didn't, I don't know why I did that, keeping all the names straight actually was kind of confusing as I finished the book. And, I didn't try to, someone may accuse me of being a little cutesy about how I changed some of the names. But I did that. And then after that, and there are other writers here this evening, at a certain point, you become attached to your characters and to the names that you've used. And I just didn't want to change them anymore. So the one character that I didn't change, and it was a sheer accident, was Joan Walters. And she since told me that she didn't actually tell me that, but I think she did. I'm going to stick to my story and she'll stick to hers.
That's what I was gonna ask, is where the dividing line was in the names, because like Loretta and Roberta, you use their real names. And some of the, the lawyers and that, they were made up, but you could tell who they were. And
Yeah.
if there was a dividing line there,
No, not really. I just kind of stumbled through it, and then I knew that certain characters, Kayla and Craig, weren't based on actual characters. I'm trying to think now. And some of the minor characters, like Tug over in Monogram News, when those characters entered the book, I wanted to stay as close to the name as I possibly could, because again, my audience is right here, or in writ large Vermilion, and having some familiarity with the names I thought would spark reader interest.
I thought I caught you in one mistake when you said Arnie smoking Camels without filters on them. That's Mom's cousin, and I remember we grew up, we were fascinated. He used to roll his own cigarettes. And I thought, he didn't smoke Camels, he rolled his own cigarettes. By the 60s, he probably did.
Well, you all remember, I preface my remarks by saying I took a lot of literary license, and I may have there. But Arnie was a heavy smoker,
Yeah,
and,
I can just picture him rolling those cigarettes.
yeah. Ruth?
Oh, does Thomas Whitehawk have any surviving relatives that you know
He had 4 brothers and sisters, I think, who were younger than him. But they were all, at the time of Kelvin's death, his father's death, they were all sent out to foster homes or some sort of setting where, they had some sort of parental influence, except Tom. Tom went to the Hare home because he was old enough to go to the Hare home, and the rest of the children were younger than him. And to my knowledge, he never communicated with them at all. Now, he may have, but not to my knowledge. He never mentioned them at all in any of the testimony that he made. And he did go back, he was furloughed a couple times and went back to the Rosebud, where he participated in a Sundance at Crow Dog's Paradise. And that was it's a big event now. And so Tom was there, and he was also the fire keeper for the sweat lodge at the prison, which I understand is no longer there either.
Great. You mentioned in the book, there's a couple of several mental health evaluations he had that were fairly limited, basic, probably due to the time, but also perhaps the motives of the attorneys and whatnot. Did he ever have any later evaluations, or you think he just didn't want to revisit? He was too confused about that to go back and talk about it more. Did he ever go through any evaluations again that you came across?
Yeah, good question. No, the last in-depth evaluation was by Dr. Joseph Satin. And he had an interesting background as well. He consulted with the prosecutors at the Clutter family murder, if you recall, in Kansas in 1966 or 67, when several family members were murdered by Hickok and Berry, the 2 infamous criminals. And ultimately, much of what he had, or some of what he said, ended up in Truman Capote's book, In Cold Blood. Right toward the end, he quotes extensively from Satin's analysis of Perry and Hickok. So he was first rate. He came from the manager clinic and did, I thought, an excellent job of evaluating Tom in his life. But it was interesting. So all that information was presented to the judge, Judge Winans, at the time when it wasn't a trial, it was a hearing to determine whether or not a new trial could be held. So Judge Winans in Sioux Falls conducted this hearing, and Joseph Satin came and testified, and Winans disregarded all of it because he said that in South Dakota, we have one test, and that's the Mcdonald Rule. The Mcdonald Rule is that if the person charged of the crime had knowledge of what they were doing at the time of the crime, they're guilty. And so he asked Joseph Satin that question: did Tom Whitehawk know what he was doing at the time of the crime? And Satin said, I can't tell you that. And psychiatrists who tell you that shouldn't be doing it because they're not practicing psychiatry. They're giving thoughts to someone that may or may not be there. So the judge disregarded that and ruled on those very thin grounds that Tom knew what he was doing at the time. The other psychiatrists, the prosecuting psychiatrist, said that he did know what was happening at the time after some very minimal, cursory examination of Tom. And that's what the judge relied upon rather than Joseph Satin's word. another, another case of, I don't, I met with a bunch of, several attorneys in Sioux Falls and about the book. It was their book club, and they, one of them was a longstanding attorney who knew Judge Winans, and he said that, the judge was a fair judge, so. He may have been, but I thought he ruled incorrectly in this case. Gary?
Even though we're not allowed to talk about so-called critical race theory in South Dakota, you suggested.
There are cameras here, Jerry.
You suggested at the beginning that you thought there were racial issues involved. This on the face of it looks like an utterly senseless crime. No motive, no rationality, apparently no real premeditation. Unless you look at, as you do it in the book, as you have done tonight, look at the whole life of trauma mixed with alcohol, and then what sets it off, you can begin to comprehend at least. But in that sense, I think on some level you've done what most novelists set out to do, and that is to tell a universal story. Because isn't this the case with many a horrendous crime like this, that what we see on the surface is the real story?
Yeah, and all of that was, as I began to get into this, it was clearly apparent. I had read sometime before I started work on this book, Norman Mailer's The Executioner's Song, and he won a Pulitzer for that. It's about Gary Gilmore, who was sentenced to death in a Utah prison. Mailer went out there and wrote a book about Gary Gilmore and the whole case. And it's just fascinating to look at the whole context, the life of, and he might have been accused of glorifying, violence. And Mailer did have that propensity, but I thought he drew a very fair portrait of this man who would otherwise confuse everybody about who he was and what he was doing. He was, just kooky. So I think that gave me some, if I read something that I admired and I thought about it in relationship to the Tom Whitehawk affair, it gave me, more guidance on how to handle all that material. Okay, well, it's past time already, so thank you all again for coming. Much appreciated, and travel safe on your way home. And I do have books, but I know most of you already read or bought the book or both, so I don't expect to sell that many books, and I won't be offended. So don't worry about that at all. I'm just so happy that you came and asked so many good questions this evening. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.